The story of the Vanderbilt Mansion begins not with mystery, but with ambition sharpened into something almost mechanical, a relentless accumulation of wealth that transformed a family name into a symbol of power across America. By the time the mansion rose along the Hudson River, the Vanderbilts were no longer merely industrialists. They were architects of an empire that had reshaped transportation, finance, and the very rhythm of American life. Yet behind the grandeur of carved stone and manicured lawns, there existed a quieter narrative, one that never appeared in official records or guided tour, a narrative built not on exaggeration, but on the subtle, often uncomfortable realities of how such a place truly functioned. Construction of the estate was precise, almost surgical in its execution, with every corridor and chamber designed to reflect not just wealth but control. The walls were thick, the ceilings high, and the layout deliberate, allowing movement to be observed, directed, and when necessary, restricted. Servants moved through separate passageways, often unseen, their presence reduced to the silent maintenance of perfection. This separation was not incidental. It was engineered to preserve an illusion, one where the household appeared to operate effortlessly, as if untouched by labor. But beneath that illusion was a rigid hierarchy that dictated where one could stand, speak, or even breathe without consequence. Within the mansion, certain rooms were known only to a select few, not hidden in the sense of secret doors or theatrical mechanisms, but obscured through purpose and access. These were spaces used for private meetings, financial discussions, and decisions that extended far beyond the estate itself. Documents were reviewed here, agreements shaped, and strategies formed that would ripple through industries and affect thousands of lives. The silence of these rooms was not peaceful. It was calculated, a silence that protected information and ensured that only those deemed worthy could participate in its exchange. Daily life within the mansion followed a rhythm that appeared elegant from a distance, but was, in reality, tightly controlled. Meals were scheduled with precision, social interactions curated, and even leisure carried an undercurrent of obligation. Guests were not simply entertained, they were evaluated, positioned within a network of influence that extended across the country. Conversations at the dining table often carried more weight than official meetings elsewhere. Decisions masked as casual remarks, alliances formed under the guise of hospitality. For the staff, the experience was markedly different. Their world existed in parallel, defined by long hours and strict expectations. Movement was often restricted to designated corridors, and interaction with the family was limited to what was necessary for service. Errors, even minor ones, could lead to immediate dismissal, and the pressure to maintain perfection was constant. This environment fostered a kind of quiet tension, one that lingered in the background of the mansion's polished surface. There were also moments that did not align with the image the estate sought to project. Occasional disputes, financial anxieties, and personal conflicts surfaced behind closed doors, carefully contained but never entirely erased. These moments revealed a more complex reality, one where wealth did not eliminate vulnerability but instead reshaped it, often making it less visible but no less significant. As the mansion settled into its role as both home and symbol, it became clear that its true function extended beyond architecture. It was a stage, a controlled environment where power could be displayed, negotiated, and preserved. Every detail, from the placement of furniture to the design of pathways, contributed to this purpose, reinforcing a structure that prioritized order and discretion above all else. Yet even within such a controlled space, there were elements that resisted complete oversight. Small inconsistencies, subtle irregularities in design and use, hinted at layers of activity that were not fully documented. These were not dramatic secrets, but they were real, embedded in the daily operations of the estate and the decisions made within its walls. They suggested that beneath the carefully maintained surface, the mansion held more than what was immediately visible, a complexity that would only become clearer over time. As years passed, the Vanderbilt Mansion evolved into more than a residence. It became a focal point for interactions that blurred the boundaries between private life and public influence. The estate hosted gatherings that, on the surface, appeared to be social occasions, yet their underlying purpose often extended into matters of business and strategy. Invitations were not distributed casually, and those who attended understood that presence alone carried implications. Within these gatherings, conversations unfolded in layers, with meaning often implied rather than explicitly stated. The design of the mansion played a significant role in facilitating this environment. Large reception rooms allowed for controlled interaction, while smaller adjoining spaces provided opportunities for more discreet discussions. Movement between these areas was fluid but intentional, enabling hosts to guide guests through a sequence of experiences that subtly influenced perception and engagement. This orchestration was not accidental. It reflected a broader understanding of how space could shape behavior. In certain sections of the mansion, access remained limited, not due to physical barriers, but through unspoken rules. These areas were associated with the more sensitive aspects of the Vanderbilt operations, including financial planning and correspondence. Records were stored and reviewed here, often away from the main flow of activity. The existence of these spaces was known, but their contents were rarely discussed, contributing to an atmosphere where information was both present and deliberately contained. The relationship between the family and their staff continued to reflect a structured hierarchy. Communication was formal, expectations were clearly defined, and deviations were rarely tolerated. Despite this rigidity, there were instances where trust developed, particularly among long-serving employees who demonstrated reliability over time. These individuals sometimes gained access to areas or information that others did not, creating subtle distinctions within the staff itself. Outside the mansion, the broader context of the Vanderbilt enterprise influenced daily life within its walls. Economic shifts, changes in industry, and evolving social dynamics all had an impact, though these influences were often managed carefully to maintain stability. Decisions made within the estate could affect operations far beyond its boundaries, reinforcing its role as a center of control. There were also periods of uncertainty, moments when external pressures challenged the sense of permanence that the mansion sought to convey. Financial fluctuations, public scrutiny, and internal disagreements occasionally disrupted the carefully maintained order. These disruptions were rarely visible to outsiders, but their effects could be felt in the atmosphere of the estate, in the tone of conversations, and the packing of daily routines. Amid these dynamics, the mansion retained its outward appearance of composure. Visitors continued to see a place defined by elegance and refinement, unaware of the complexities that underpinned its operation. This contrast between appearance and reality was not unique to the Vanderbilt Mansion, but within its walls, it was particularly pronounced, shaped by a combination of wealth, influence, and deliberate management. Over time, patterns began to emerge, revealing how the mansion functioned not just as a physical structure, but as a system. Its design, routines, and social practices all contributed to a cohesive environment where control was maintained through both visible and invisible means. Understanding this system required looking beyond individual events and considering how each element interacted with the others, forming a network of relationships that defined the estate. As the early 20th century progressed, the Vanderbilt Mansion began to reflect broader changes occurring across society. The structures of power that had once seemed unshakable were gradually being questioned, and the dynamics within the estate adapted in response. While the outward appearance remained consistent, subtle shifts in behavior and decision-making indicated that the environment was no longer as fixed as it had once been. Within the mansion, the use of certain spaces began to change. Rooms that had once been reserved for private negotiations saw less frequent use, while other areas became more central to daily life. This redistribution of activity suggested an adjustment in priorities, influenced by external conditions and internal considerations. The mansion was not static. It responded, albeit cautiously, to the evolving context in which it existed. The role of staff also experienced gradual transformation. Expectations remained high, but there was a growing recognition of the need for adaptability. Long-standing practices were occasionally modified, not out of preference, but necessity. These changes did not eliminate the hierarchical structure, but they introduced variations that altered how it functioned in practice. Financial considerations became increasingly prominent during this period. While the Vanderbilt name continued to carry significant weight, the economic landscape was shifting in ways that required careful management. Decisions made within the mansion reflected a heightened awareness of these changes, with greater emphasis placed on sustainability and long-term planning. Discussions that had once focused primarily on expansion began to incorporate elements of preservation. Despite these adjustments, the mansion retained elements of its earlier character. The emphasis on discretion, control, and presentation remained central, shaping how the estate was perceived both internally and externally. However, maintaining this balance required ongoing effort, as the conditions that had originally supported it were no longer entirely stable. There were also instances where the limitations of this approach became apparent. Situations arose that could not be fully managed through existing structures, exposing vulnerabilities that had previously been concealed. These moments did not dismantle the system, but they highlighted its constraints, demonstrating that even the most carefully constructed environments are subject to external forces. The interplay between continuity and change defined this phase of the mansion's history. Each decision, each adjustment, contributed to a gradual reconfiguration of how the estate operated. This process was not always visible, but its effects accumulated over time, shaping the trajectory of the mansion and its role within a changing world. In its later years as a private residence, the Vanderbilt Mansion stood as both a symbol of its origins and a reflection of transformation. The elements that had once defined its operation, strict hierarchy, controlled interaction, and strategic use of space, remained present, but they existed within a context that had fundamentally shifted. The estate was no longer at the center of an expanding empire. Instead, it occupied a more complex position, balancing legacy with adaptation. The transition from private residence to public site introduced a new dimension to the mansion's identity. Areas that had once been restricted became accessible, though the narratives presented to visitors often emphasized certain aspects while omitting others. This selective presentation was not unusual, but it reinforced the distinction between what was shown and what remained less visible. Historical records provided insight into the mansion's operation, but they were not comprehensive. Gaps remained, particularly in relation to informal practices and undocumented decisions. These gaps contributed to an ongoing sense of ambiguity, where certain aspects of the mansion's history could be inferred but not fully confirmed. This ambiguity is often interpreted as mystery, though it is more accurately understood as the result of incomplete documentation. The physical structure of the mansion also retained traces of its past functions. Architectural details, spatial arrangements, and material choices all reflected decisions made with specific purposes in mind. While these features are now appreciated for their aesthetic qualities, they also serve as evidence of how the estate was originally intended to operate. Today, the Vanderbilt Mansion is viewed through multiple lenses, as a historical artifact, an architectural achievement, and a representation of a particular period in American history. Each perspective offers valuable insight, but none fully captures the complexity of the environment that once existed within its walls. To understand that complexity requires acknowledging both the visible and the concealed elements, the documented and the implied. The so-called dark secrets of the mansion are not defined by dramatic revelations or hidden mechanisms, but by the realities of how power, wealth, and control were exercised in a specific context. They are found in the structures that govern daily life, the decisions made in private, and the ways in which information was managed and contained. These elements may not align with popular expectations of secrecy, but they are integral to understanding the true nature of the estate. In the end, the Vanderbilt Mansion remains a place where appearance and reality intersect, where history is both preserved and interpreted. Its significance lies not only in what it reveals, but in what it suggests, offering a nuanced perspective on a world that was carefully constructed, meticulously maintained, and ultimately shaped by forces both within and beyond its control.